Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf bet. Welcome to Masechet Gittin. Very exciting to be starting a new Masechet. We'll see right away it's got a very different style to it. It's a much more legalistic type of book, type of Masechet, and it's actually considered one of the classics. It's one of the ones that are learned in general and in schools and yeshivot, etc. I used to teach it in high school. There's a lot of interesting topics. We'll get to a whole section on Tikkun Olam, which is very interesting. We actually have an in-depth course on a few of the sugyot in the fourth parak on our course website. So if anyone's interested later in learning more about it, you can go more in depth. There's a bookmark. We have bookmarks on all Seder Nashim. So, which actually reminds you that we're already preparing. We'll be finishing Seder Nashim after Masechet Kiddushin, which is the next Masechet. And if anybody wants to sponsor the bookmarks for Masechet, for Seder Nizikin, you can write to us on our email. So Masechet Gittin is sponsored by Elaine and Saul Schreiber in honor of their daughter-in-law, Daniela Schreiber. Kol hakavod on receiving your Master's of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy. We are so proud of you. This week's learning is also dedicated in honor of Daniela Bella Schreiber, in honor of your completion of your Master's of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy. Daniela, you inspire us every day with your focus and determination. We know firsthand how lucky your clients would be to have you in their lives. Love, your Mahjong friends. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Farber in honor of Rabbanit Michelle. Thank you for guiding me on the path of daf Yomi and life for the past 2,711 pages. Thank you, Judy, and thank you for sharing your Siyum Hashas with us last night. Today's daf is sponsored by Lynn K, Joe Nadis, and Maya Zanger Nadis in honor of the Shloshim of their grandmother, Marilyn Kurtz Zanger. Grandma always kept us in line, making sure we understood our intellectual and cultural heritage and quietly sneaking us sugar cereal when we came to visit. She passed away at 97 after being the head of the family for decades. Grandma, we love and miss you. There's a study guide for today, so you can use that. If you don't have a bookmark, you can write to us. We can send you a bookmark, and you can also find a PDF of the bookmark in today's daf post. So that will also give you some help throughout the Masechet. It both has checklist of all the pages, so you can mark off everything you've learned, and also it has a bunch of terms that are key terms for the Masechet that are important to know. Okay, before we start actually the learning, I want to give some background information. First of all, recommended always to listen to Dr. Ayala Lipson's introductions, very helpful, very useful information. And I'm going to give a shorter introduction, but I will give somewhat of an introduction to the topic of Gittin. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and we'll start with some of the psukim in the Torah as they appear in the study guide. So we want to find the psukim that have to do with get in the Torah. Get is a divorce document. First of all, it's interesting that Kiddushin comes after get. You would have thought, especially in the Torah, Kiddushin appears first, then Gittin. There's some different, answers given. You want to, they say, lahagdim makal refuah, right? You want to first say how to get out of the, before you say getting into it, how you would get out of it if you need to. Kind of a bit of a joke, but probably it's here because of this first pasuk, okay? And its connection to sota. So it says in the first pasuk here, we're in chapter 24, verse 1. If a man takes a woman and has relations with her, what this means is for the purposes of marriage, okay, betrothed someone and marries them. Now, if she all of a sudden doesn't find favor in his eyes, because he found something, some sort of erva behavior, some sort of licentious behavior on her part. Actually, interesting, are these two separate things? Are these two possibilities? Either he just doesn't like her, or he finds something where she, and that connects with the sota, right? That she was doing something inappropriate. Or is it she didn't find favor in his eyes because she did something inappropriate? And then there's a whole debate, which we'll only get to on the very last page of Gittin, between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel on what grounds can a husband divorce a wife. Does it have to be, there has to be some sort of erva, she was somehow cheating on him in some way? Or is it enough that, according to Beit Hillel, she burns his food, and because of that, he wants to divorce her? So how much of a reason does he need to divorce her is a question that comes out of this pasuk. But the main thing that's interesting about this pasuk is when it talks about marriage and divorce in the Torah, it's all kind of by the way. Okay, what it's saying is if a man marries a woman and then decides to divorce her, and we're still in the if this were to happen, v'katav la sefer kritut, and then he wrote her a book that separates between them, that breaks the covenant they built. V'natam biyada, he gives it into her hands, v'shulchami beito, and he sends her out of his house. V'yatzami beito v'halcha v'ayta le'ish acher, and then she leaves his house. Now, this is all the if. If this were to happen, and then she leaves his house, and then she goes and gets married to somebody else, usne'a ish acharon, and then he dislikes her, v'katav la'sefer krichuv v'natam biyada v'shulchami beito, a repetition of what just happened, and then he divorces her. Or he dies, lo yuchal ba'ala rishon asher shelcha lashuv lekachta liyodo liisha. This first husband can no longer, who already sent her out of his house, can't remarry her. Okay, and then this says it's a toiva and lo tachtia ta'aret. This will soil the land. Okay. The main thing that's interesting about this is if you had to put a subject line on what this is talking about, this section in the Torah, it's talking about something called machzir grushato, someone who wants to remarry his divorced wife after she married somebody else in the interim. But it's actually, right, through these psukim where marriage and divorce are mentioned, by the way, we learn all the halachot in the Torah of marriage and divorce from these very few words, really all in Pasuk Aleph, that are mentioned here. Okay, so it's a very interesting situation that the Torah doesn't really write, this is how you get married, this is how you get divorced, but it's all learned out of here. And I want to just read through the Rambam, the first halacha in Hilchot Gerushin, and we're going to show where the Rambam, I made a chart here. The Rambam is going to say there's 10 main points about divorce in the Torah, and this is why I wanted to start with it. It gives us a little bit of background about what's needed for divorce and where he gets it from in the psukim. A woman only gets divorced with writing. But this is very different from marriage. Marriage is done either with a ring, right, or money, something of monetary value. Generally, we do it with a ring, with a document, it could be, or with having sexual relations with the intent for the betrothal. Now, this is very different from gerushin, where it has to be written. Okay, possible reasons could be they didn't want men to divorce their wives very easily, so they made them have to write it. Now, for you and I to sit down and write something is not so complicated. In those days, only sofrim wrote, and even nowadays, again, you would have to have a sofer write it. We don't just write it ourselves, and there's all sorts of criteria of how it needs to be written and on what kind of parchment, etc., to make it more difficult so that the husbands don't just easily divorce their wives. Also, the woman's status, when she gets married, she becomes a married woman. Okay, but before that, she's actually permitted to anybody. Once she gets married, she's a married woman. Now, a married woman has very strict laws upon her. She can't be with any other man, right? It's a very serious issue. So to get out of that, you need something more. To get into it is not so difficult, but to get out of that, to remove the status of Eshet Ish, it could be you need something much more substantial, something written. Okay, so K'tam Zehu Anikra Get, this is what we call a get. It's going to be difficult in my summaries. I'm going to be writing the word get all the time, but right, it doesn't mean the word get in English. It's going to mean get in Hebrew. And then he lists 10 main points from the Torah. And then at the end, I'm going to just kind of skim it now. After all that, what you can see at the bottom of the chart is everything else in the get, like the date and the signatures of the witnesses, and all that is all rabbinic. Okay, but these are the things that are from the Torah. Number one, the divorce has to be by the husband's will. This is the most important one and the most relevant nowadays, and then too, where there were all these situations where husbands weren't living with their wives but didn't want to give them gets. Okay, it happens nowadays. It's what we call, right, aguna problems. So the husband, it has to be willing. So if you try to force the husband, only if in the end he does it willingly is the divorce a good divorce. He doesn't want to get divorced. You can't force him to do this. Where do they get it from? Well, it describes the situation of divorce. He has to be the one to decide. Now, notice in the Torah, she is not a player here in terms of her will. Whereas when it comes to marriage, by Torah law, she has to agree to it. If she doesn't agree to the marriage, it's not a marriage. However, to get divorced, only his will is what's important, not hers. This is a very big issue and a very big inconsistency. Rabbeinu Gershom, in the 11th century, basically changes this. And he says women also have to be willing partners. And he changes this, at least for Ashkenazim, that if a man cannot give a get to a woman if she doesn't want to receive the get. Okay, she can refuse to receive the get. This is why what we have nowadays, and then also, is called a heter mea rabbanim. If the woman refuses to give the get, and she's being, and at least the rabbis perceive her, and this is the big problem, of being the one causing issues for no good reason, and they view her as, being the wrong person in this story, in this situation, they can issue what's called a heter mea rabbanim. They can get 100 rabbis to sign on a document and overturn. This is why a heter mea rabbanim only works for a woman who's refusing to give a get, because the heter mea rabbanim basically says, we rabbis are overriding the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom, basically, okay? And then they can override that with this heter. And basically what they're really doing is they're allowing the husband to have 2 wives, okay? Which is also part of takana Rabbeinu Gershom, right? That a man can't marry more than one woman. So he's overriding that. Okay, the law in Israel, by the way, so if you talk about Sfaradim, for sure the law in the land of Israel is to also, right, for Sfaradim also, they can't divorce a woman against her will. So this is a very relevant halacha, and the inequality between men and women really comes from the Torah, because it's only the man who gets to decide in the Torah, and Rabbeinu Gershom tried to fix it, but there's ways around that because it's not Torah law. Okay, continuing in the next one. It has to be written, because it says v'katav la sefer. Sefer doesn't mean a book necessarily, but it has to be written down. The content has to be that she is no longer connected to him, right? He's removing her from his domain. That's v'shilchami beito, because it says, and he sends her from his house. The wording of the get has to say we are no longer married, right? We're separating. That's because it says sefer kritut. Lichlot is to cut all ties. This is something we're already going to see on the first page. It has to be written specifically for him and for her. Okay, here they're really going to learn it from her. But katav la, he writes to her. This book to her means in her name. That means that. I'll give you the example of the Gemara, if I recall correctly. It's Yosef and Miriam. We have a guy named Yosef, a woman named Miriam. They're married. Yosef writes a get to Miriam. He hires a sofer. He gets the whole get written. And then he realizes he doesn't want to divorce her. So he throws it in the garbage, passes by a second Yosef who's married to a Miriam as well. He picks up the get and wants to use it for his wife. No can do. Okay. Or a sofer can't just keep, right, gets in file. Let's say someone hired him and then they changed their mind. You could just keep it and say, oh, next time I need someone with this name, I'll just use it. No, it has to be written specifically for her. And for him. Because it says vikatav vinatan. That means, right, he writes her the get and then he gives it to her. They have to be one able to be done immediately after the other. So for example, if you wrote it on a leaf or something that was attached to the ground, you can actually write it on a leaf if you wanted. You really could write it properly. But you have to detach it from the ground before you give it to her, because you can't give her something that's attached to the ground. So that wouldn't be good. You won't be able to write it on that leaf that's attached to the ground because it's missing, right? There's an action you have to do before you give it to her. We'll see this a lot later on. So he has to give it to her, right? We said she doesn't have to agree to get the get, but it has to be actually given to her. Okay, to her, it could be her messenger, it could be in her domain, but it has to be given to her. You have to do it before witnesses. This is what we call the edei mesira. Okay, there has to be a transaction where he gives the get and edim witness this. Okay, and we already saw the Rambam said that the signatures of the witnesses on the get is not so important. That's because the Rambam holds, and this is a very central machloket we're going to see throughout the Masechet. Already on Daf Daled, we're going to get to it. Is it the edei mesira, the ones who watch the get being passed, that are the main ones? And that's the way the Rambam holds, like Rabbi Elazar. Or Rabbi Meir holds it's this witnesses that sign on the document that are the most important. And that's edei chatima. So that's not what the Rambam holds. The Rambam thinks that's only rabbinic. Okay, the ones who sign on the get is not as important as the ones who actually witness the get being given to her. That's the main thing, right? You could have a document, but if he doesn't give it to her, it's meaningless. So they have to actually witness the action of her receiving the get. She has to give it to her with the intent to divorce her. And shiabal oshlucho hu shenot nola. Has to be given to her either by the husband or because of the concept of shlucho shel adam kemoto, and that's a big topic that's going to come up here because we're using often there's cases, and we'll start with the first case where a messenger is bringing the get. Either he or a messenger that he set up to be in place of him has to be the one to give it because it says Binatan biyadan, who's the subject of that sentence. He gives it into her hands. He is the husband, so either he or his messenger. Okay, and that's a concept that I'll already explain now, which is there's two types of shlichuyot, or messengers that are going on here. One is the husband's messenger. That's called shaliach holacha, the shaliach that brings the get to the woman. And then there's shaliach kabbalah. That could be her witness that she says, I want you to accept the get on my behalf. Now, it's only a get once it comes into her hands or her shaliach's hands. So if he sends a shaliach, she's not divorced yet until the get either comes to her hands or her messenger's hands. With that, we're going to get started with our Masechah. It's a little bit of background, but we'll get to all these things later. So, sometimes the first day you hear them, they don't exactly get absorbed yet, but as we get through the Masechah, all these concepts will become very familiar to you. Hamivi get mi medinat hayam. So as we said yesterday in the Siyum, we start out in a bit of a strange place. Just like the Torah kind of didn't really go head first into this is how you get married, this is how you get divorced. The Mishnah also doesn't even start out with how you get divorced. They start out with a seemingly common case because the Gemara talks about it a lot and it certainly spends a lot of ink on this. But really, it seems like it probably was a very rare case. The case is somebody brings a get to his wife. He's living abroad. She's living in Israel. And he sends the get through a messenger. Okay, how common was it that a couple was living in a totally different location and he needs to send the get with somebody else because they don't live in the same, right? Not same city, not same country. Seems very odd that in those days, this was a common occurrence. Okay, and yet we're starting our Masechah. So if somebody sends a get from abroad, Medinat Hayam, which sounds like across the sea, right? It sounds like a faraway place. Sarich Shiur, and he sends it with a messenger. When the messenger delivers the get to the woman, he has to say the following declaration. In front of me it was written, in front of me it was signed. We have no idea yet why he's saying this, what the purpose is, but he has to say this. And in which case, when he brings it from abroad to Israel. Rabban Gamliel says, he's going to say there's also other places, not just far away, but even if you come from Rechem or Cheger and you bring it from there, not exactly clear where these places are. There's debates about where exactly they are, but they seem to be border towns. They're across the border on the other side. They're not Medinat Hayam, which makes it sound far away, but they're close. And I put here on the chart because we're going to have a lot of discussions about what exactly, where do you need to bring it from? It's a good question about whether Rabban Gamliel is disagreeing with Tanakama and Medinat Hayam really means far away, and he's saying even close. Or Medinat Hayam is just a general term, and Rabban Gamliel is defining it, that Medinat Hayam includes anything that's outside the borders of Israel. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, afilu mikfar ludim lelud. He says, and again, question, is he adding, is he disagreeing? Right? It seems like he's disagreeing with Rabban Gamliel. The question is he trying to explain Tanakama? He says, even from Kfar Ludim, which is also outside the border, we'll get in the Gemara later to what's the difference between these places. Even if you bring it from there to Lod, which apparently was very close, okay, and it's a very short distance, but one is in the border and one is outside the border. So you would also need to do it. Chachamim Obrim, and now all of a sudden we had Tanakama, we have Rabban Gamliel, we have Rabbi Eliezer, now we get to the Chachamim. And there's a big debate in the Gemara about whether the rabbis disagree with Tanakama or whether they're actually just explaining Tanakama and saying Tanakama said it in short, but we're going to explain really all the cases that it refers to. You don't need to say this, ella, unless, meaning you need to say it in the following cases. It's a very wordy kind of way of saying it. Okay, that's Tanakama, someone who brings a get from abroad to here. V'hamolich, and one who brings it from Israel to abroad. Okay, that means it's both directions. It's not just abroad to Israel, it's also Israel to abroad. We're starting to get some hints as to possible reasons why, right? Does it have to do with the distance? Or does it have to do with, you hold that Tanakama disagrees with the rabbis, he only thinks it's from abroad to Israel, but Israel to abroad, you don't need it. Because in Israel, I don't know what, fill in the blank, right? You have to say abroad this, Israel that. So we'll have to see. Now it seems to be either the rabbis talking, or maybe we're back to Tanakama, it's unclear. Someone who brings from Medina le Medina in Medinat Hayam, different countries abroad, from one country to a different country, also tzarich she'omar b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. They also need to say b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. Rashbag adds, afilu mehegmonia lehegmonia. Hegmonia lehegmonia could be even the same city, but there's different rulers. The obvious thing that comes to mind is East Berlin and West Berlin, right? Where you basically have, you can't go from East Berlin to West Berlin, right? Not nowadays, but then. So this is places where you can't go from one to the other, even if they're in the same area, okay? And they're close, but people can't go from one to the other. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mirekem lemizrach berekem kimizrach. Rabbi Yehuda is basically putting out the boundaries of what's considered Israel and what's not Israel for these purposes. He says Rekem, he seems to agree with Rabban Gamliel, that from Rekem and eastward, which clearly shows Rekem was on the eastern border, and eastward is outside of Israel. Rekem kamizrach, and Rekem itself is considered like the east, meaning it's not Israel. Me'ashkelon lidarom, the Ashkelon kidarom. Interestingly, the Ashkelon, right, which we think is in the border of Israel, is actually considered outside the border of Israel for this purpose. And Akko litzafon va'akko kitzafon, on the northern border, right? So we have Ashkelon on the south, Rekem on the east. Obviously, the west is the Mediterranean, and we have Akko in the north, and Akko is considered like the north. Okay, meaning Akko is considered, again, it's a little bit strange, outside the border of Israel. Whole debate about the commentaries, why exactly these were considered the border cities, but big discussion we're not going to get into. Rabbi Meir Omer, Akko ke'eretz Yisrael legiti. Rabbi Meir disagrees about Akko and says, no. Comes to this issue, Akko is considered part of Israel for Gittin. Sounds like maybe not necessarily for other places, for other things. It's a whole debate whether Akko was a city that was mainly inhabited by non-Jews. Maybe that was the issue. What are the other issues that it is considered not like Israel? Okay, so that's also another question. Hamivi get Eretz Israel. A notes that, right, the Gemara is going to get into all these things as we go on. Okay, this is just the beginning. This is the Mishnah, and then we'll get it. We haven't even explained why you need to say b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. So it's very hard to understand why these places are considered either yes in Israel or not in Israel if we don't even know what the issues are. Hamivi get be'eretz Israel. In 1-2 minutes, we're going to get there. So, hamivi get be'eretz Israel. What if you bring a get within Israel? A note tzarich she'omar b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. You don't need to say this declaration at all, okay, if it's within Israel. But what if somebody comes and claims this is not a good get? What do you do then? What do? You verify the signatures. Okay, that means you either find the people who signed and have them sign, like when you go to a bank and you put your signature on record, have them sign and check that their signature matches their signature there and that it's legit. Or find people who recognize their signatures. Maybe the court has records of signatures. Maybe they've signed other documents. And then as long as we can ratify their signatures and say their signatures are good, then if someone's claiming it's not a good document, which is probably the husband who wants to claim you're still married to me, and she's already possibly even married to somebody else based on her get, or at least looking to get married to someone else, and he claims we're still married, if you can verify the signatures, then you're fine. So that was a lot in one Mishnah, a lot of different opinions, and without really fully understanding. So now we're going to get to the Gemara, my time. What is the reason for this b'fanei nechtam of b'fanei nechtam? So we're going to have Raba and Rava. Okay, Raba is spelled with a hey and pronounced with a bet in the middle, and Rava is spelled with an aleph at the end and pronounced Rava with a vet as opposed to a bet. But it's very confusing, and especially we're going to spend the next few days on Raba and Rava, and I'll give you an mnemonic how to remember who says what. Raba Amal. So Raba holds that the reason for all this b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam, turning now to Amabed, is l'pisha ein b'ki'in lishma. It's because people abroad, now notice most of the issue, according to most of the opinions, was anyone coming from abroad, right? We said within Israel, it's not a problem. There was a debate, maybe bringing from Israel to abroad. Okay, so we're going to have to explain that opinion according to Raba. But what Raba is saying is the difference between people who live in Israel, remember the center in the time of the Mishnah was Israel. Difference between people living in Israel and people living abroad is that people living abroad don't know this halacha of lishma. They don't know that the get has to be written specifically for this woman and this man. And therefore, there's a concern that maybe they're using a get that wasn't written specifically for them. If the witness comes and says, messenger comes and says, Bifanai nechtavu, bifanai nechtam, in front of me it was written, in front of me it was signed, that means it must have been written and signed lishma. Okay, later there's going to be a whole discussion. Who's the Tana who holds you need both a written and signed lishma? One holds only writing, one holds only signing. We'll get to a whole question about that, but we'll deal with that later. There'll be a lot of questions on Raba and Rava. How do you remember Raba is the one who says lishma? Because lishma ends with a hey, and Raba's name ends with a hey. So that's the easy way to remember. So he says the whole issue is ein b'ki'in lishma. Now, what does it mean? They didn't know this halacha of lishma. Okay, seems like a pretty basic halacha. And Tosfot says, I don't really get this. So if you look at Tosfot, l'fisha ein b'ki'in lishma, Tosfot says, starts up and says, itema, ma'ishna lishma de ein b'ki'in misharu chot Gittin, k'go mechubar b'shina shmo shma v'nechtav hayom v'nechtam balayla. He says, I don't understand. There's a million other halachot. What? They know all those halachot and they just don't know lishma? So if you skip down about 10 lines in Tosfot, he says that Mefarish Rabbeinu Tam, he understands that they're not b'ki'in doesn't mean they don't know. He says the following: they know all the halachot. It's not that they don't know halacha. They just don't really buy into this drasha of v'katav la. Okay, the fact that he writes to her doesn't necessarily mean the get has to be written specifically for her. Okay, if it has her name in it, what's the difference? If it has his name in it, what's the difference? Right? What's the difference? So they didn't buy into this drasha. It's not that they didn't know anything. If they didn't know anything, then they didn't know all sorts of things, not just lishma. So Tosfot, again, it's Tosfot's explanation. Not everybody thinks this. Some people think they just weren't knowledgeable. Anyone outside of Israel, reasonable. There weren't yeshivas in those days outside of Israel too much. So they just didn't know. But Tosfot says, ein b'ki'in means they're not experts in. But ein b'ki'in here means ein chosheshin lidrasha de lishma. They just don't buy into that drasha. And then we're going to see later that there's a time period where la'achar shalamdu, that all the people abroad eventually learned it. And then things changed. So now they say, what does it mean after they learned it? After they accepted it. Okay. It doesn't mean after they learned it that they didn't learn it before and now they learned it. No, it means he just translates it to match his commentary after they accepted it. And then at a certain point, they realize maybe this is an important drasha. So that's an interesting interpretation that helps us understand a little bit better how could it possibly be. And he has a really good question, which is number one, how could they not know? But even if they knew, right? In other words, if you say they didn't know, but then it doesn't make any sense. That's the only thing they didn't know, and they knew everything else. Okay, so that's the first explanation. Rava Amal, Lefisha Ein Edim Tzuyin L'Kaima. Rava says that's not the problem. The problem is that there's no witnesses to verify the signatures. If the husband sends a get from abroad, and then look at the last line in the Mishnah. The last line in the Mishnah said, if you bring a get in Israel, you don't have to say this declaration. So what happens if the husband comes to claim it's not a good get? So you verify the signatures. How do you do that? You find the witnesses. You find people who know the witnesses. If the get's brought from abroad, nobody recognizes those signatures of those witnesses. You can't find the witnesses. The witnesses are abroad still. They didn't bring the get. So the job of this person is to say, I saw it written, I saw it signed, I can verify that. He's basically verifying the signatures in the get. And then the court can say, this is a good get. If the husband comes later and claims it's not a valid get, it's already ratified in the court. Okay, so that's the issue here. Is it that we're worried they're not b'ki'in lishma? Now, both of these cases are concerned that the husband's going to come along and claim that the get is not a valid get. And then the question is, what can the woman do? So if he claims it wasn't written lishma, well, she could say, what do you mean? It was written lishma. The guy came and said, in front of me it was written, in front of me it was signed, meaning it was done lishma. If he comes, right, that's Rava. According to Rava, the issue is that we're worried he's going to come and say, it's a forgery, what you're showing me. This is really not a get. Those aren't witnesses. And then she wants to go look for the witnesses. She can't find them. So we have this person who said, no, it was written in front of me. It was signed in front of me. It's all good. Okay. And then it's already ratified. So it protects. This is all fascinating. We're starting with this topic. Talked about this at the Siyum, of protecting the woman from a husband who's going to be taking advantage of her. Okay. You might remember that already in the beginning of Sota, in the beginning of Nedarim and Nazir, we already started with a very fascinating issue on Daf 1, like is it okay to take vows, right? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing to be a Nazir? Is it a bad thing to be a Nazir? In Sota, it was, is it right? Is the husband responsible or not? Like all these, and here immediately we get into, we're going to see in a minute, and by the end of today's daf, the very last line, it's actually in tomorrow's daf, but we're going to read it today, is the topic of aguna and protecting women from being agunot, which is the central theme, right? And already on daf 1, we're on daf bet, we're already struggling with this issue of husbands trying to take advantage of their wives and how to protect them, okay, or their divorced wives, and husband who will come later and claim you're still married, and how do we protect this woman? Okay, so that's the two opinions. First thing we're going to do is my benayu. What's the practical difference between these two approaches? Okay, for this, I'll pull up the study guide, and we're going to see it in a chart. It's easier when you see it charted out because we're going to have a zigzag. We're going to have 3 cases. Case number 1, according to Raba, it's going to be yes, you still need to say it, and Rava, no. Case number 2, it's going to be the flip, and case number 3, it's going to flip back the other way. So my benayu, what's the difference, the halacha, whether you say it's b'ki'in l'shma or whether you say there's no witnesses because it's far away? So ika benayu da'atyu beitre. If 2 people, if let's say the husband sent 2 messengers, so now according to Rabba, you would still need to say b'fanei nechtam b'fanei nechtam, because the fact that there's 2 witnesses doesn't change anything. The point is, we want to know, was it written lishma or was it not? And the only way we can do that is if the people who bring the documents say it was written lishma. According to Rava, though, if the whole issue is that we're worried about finding people, the witnesses, to verify the signatures of the witnesses in the document, well, if I have 2 witnesses who bring this document, presumably they're staying in Israel right now, right? The husband sent it with someone who was planning to be in Israel. So what do? We know now we don't need to say b'fanei nechtam right now, because if the husband comes later and has an issue, we'll just find those 2 witnesses who brought it and we'll have them verify the signatures. So you wouldn't need to say it right now to prevent some future problem, because when the future problem arises, we can deal with it then. Inami, second option, mi medina le medina be'eretz Israel. What if you're going from one country to another in Israel? What does that mean? Or one state. Really means the Galil and Judea, right? The Galilee and Judea were 2 separate areas. So, and presumably there wasn't a lot of, although we'll get back to this in the Gemara later, people didn't necessarily go from one place to the other, even though they kind of did. But we'll leave it right now as if they're 2 separate jurisdictions or 2 separate areas. And therefore, if it's Medina le Medina be'eretz Israel, if the issue is b'ki'in lishma, well, they live in Israel, so they're b'ki'in lishma. Remember, we made that distinction, Israel versus abroad. So since they're from Israel, that's no problem. Since if you say it's Eini di Mitzuyim l'kaimo, we won't be able to find witnesses. Well, if you're living in Judea and the people in the Galilee are far away, it's going to be a big pain if she has to go find the witnesses that are in the Galilee. If the husband comes to claim it's a forged document, so then it would be an issue, and you would need the witnesses to say b'fanei nechtam b'fanei nechtam. Third option, inami ba'otam medina b'medinat hayam. The reverse case. What if you're in the same country abroad? So if you say it's lishma, it's an issue because they live abroad and they don't either buy into or they don't have this, they don't know this drasha of lishma, and then you would still need, when they brought the get from one country to the other, they would have to say b'fanei nechtam b'fanei nechtam. But if the issue is finding witnesses that are easily found, well, they're in the same country, it shouldn't be complicated to find the witnesses. And then you wouldn't, according to Rava, need to say b'fanei nechtam b'fanei nechtam. So as I said, this was a zigzag. The first one, if 2 people bring it, you still need to say it if it's lishma. And the last one, you'd still need to say it if it's lishma, if it's 2 countries from one to the other. But the middle one, you wouldn't need it lishma. You would specifically need it, right? The same country in different provinces in Israel. You wouldn't need a lishma issue, but you would need it if it was that you can't find witness. Now we get to our first question. First, we're going to ask this question on Raba, then we're going to ask it on Rava. And this is one of a very, very, very famous sugya. We'll see why in a minute. So we're going to start a whole slew of questions on them from all sorts of sources. And it's going to continue through to Daf Dalet at least. I think it ends on Daf Dalet. I don't know if you've thought about this, but what's this witness doing? This witness is basically coming to say, this get was written lishma and signed lishma. Now, if that's what he's saying, this basically means he's a witness. He's not just a messenger, he's a witness. Now, don't we have a rule in law? We've seen this a whole bunch of times. In fact, recently we just did this about Eid Echad being believed in certain cases, but generally we need two witnesses to establish anything. So if you're saying the whole issue is to establish the Shema, and it's going to be an issue also according to Rava, but right now we're just focusing on Rava. If the issue is the Shema, and this witness, this messenger who comes is basically saying, this was written and signed in front of me, and I know it's the Shema, don't we need two witnesses to verify this, not one? To which the Gemara simply answers, Eid Echad ne'eman b'isurim. When it comes to prohibitions, one witness is believed. What are we talking about, prohibition? So Rashi said, right, okay, this is a basic halacha. Why are you allowed to eat in somebody's house who says they keep kosher, right? Assuming they're shomer mitzvot they keep Shabbat, let's say. So you can trust their kashrut. How do you trust their kashrut? Not only is it one witness who's saying my house is kosher, but they're even nogeh b'davar, right? They're the ones who are talking about themselves. But we allow a weak kind of testimony by person themselves saying, I keep kosher, to allow you to eat in their house. Why is that? Because Eid Echad ne'eman b'isurim. So Rashi says, for example, like that the fact that you said, I took trumot masrot for my produce, I slaughtered the animal, or it was slaughtered properly, or you took out the gid, or the chalev, the forbidden fats, okay? All these kind of eating issues, for example, you can believe one witness that this was done. So therefore, also here, we can believe one witness. Tosfot takes some issue with Rashi about some of his cases. He said, those are actually in a different category because those you can actually fix. Like, hafrashat trumot masrot, I can fix. So there's a different reason why one witness is believed, because something I can easily fix, I'm believed to say it's fixed, because since I can do it myself, it's pretty easy. Whereas this, obviously, you can't do it yourself. You can't give a get to the wife for somebody else, right? So, unless obviously made you a shaliach, but the assumption is you can't fix it yourself. But in any case, Tosfot disagrees a little bit with the definition of what cases are isurim. But the main point is one witness is believed when it comes to, now this is an isur, this is eshatish. Is she married? Is she not? That's isurim. One witness should be believed. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? That's not true in this case. Imor da'amrin an eid echad ne'eman b'isurim is in a particular situation like this. Kigon, chaticha safek shel chalev, safek shel shuman. If we're eating together and there's on the plate some fats of the animal, and we don't know, are they forbidden fats or are they permitted fats? And we ask someone there and they tell us, yeah, we're not sure, it's safek chalev, safek shuman. And they say, oh, it's shuman, you can eat it. Well, then we believe one witness. Why is that? Delo itchazik isur. Because its status, it wasn't like it had status of being forbidden. It had no status. Right? We didn't know the status. It was unknown status. And we want to just verify the status. That's easy to say, we'll accept one witness. Aval hacha, and here they're actually it's a little confusing because there's no vav in between the two things, but it seems to be two different issues. Okay, they start off with one and then they're going to morph into another. Aval, so the first one is this. Hacha itchazik isura de eshadish. This woman is now a married woman. Her status, without the get, her status is she's a married woman. She's already what we call chaticha d'isura. She's a forbidden item. She's forbidden to every man in the world other than her husband. If we want to change her status, how on earth can we allow that with one witness only? If you want to take something with no status and determine what its status is, so then yes. But if you want to change its status, no way, no how can you rely on one witness? So that's question number one. And assuming we're going to go with the version that adds a vav here, otherwise it really doesn't make sense. And additionally, v'havi davar shebe'erva. This is also an erva-related issue. This has to do with if she ends up, yes, being married, the get is no good, and we've relied on this one witness, right? We want to rely on one witness to say she's not a married woman. If we rely on that one witness and she goes and sleeps with someone, that is erva if she really isn't divorced, right? That's quite serious. Eshet isha, married woman, you have the death penalty for that. And it's erva. This we've seen before also. Anything related to erva needs two witnesses. How do we know that? It's actually from our pasuk that we just read. You find some issue of erva. Daval appears in the pasuk of erva. And it says, Al pishnayim edim yakum davar. Things are established, and davar is established by two. From there, they learn any erva related issue needs two. So we have two reasons here why there's no way we should believe one witness. Okay, which puts us back to square one. How can we believe one witness here? Number one, she's got a presumption of being married. Number two, it's erva. To get her out of erva, we need two witnesses. To which the Gemara answers a very interesting answer. We thought that Rabba was saying that people don't know this halacha of lishma, or they don't keep it, depending on which translation you go by. But comes the Gemara and says, actually, rov b'kiyin him. Most people really do keep this drasha of lishma. We're not really so worried about it. And afilu, now we go by laws of majority in general. So that means by Torah law, it's not an issue. And even the Rabbi Meir, the Chayish L'miuta, you might remember Rabbi Meir. He said in a case where a person under the age of 13 is supposed to do yibum, is he allowed to or not? Do we have to worry that maybe he's a saris? Maybe he won't be able to have children, in which case he won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum or chalitza right now because he can't even have children. And then the question is, can he do yibum or chalitza when he's at that young age? And the answer is, Rabbi Meir says, we have to worry that maybe he's from the minority of people who are sarisim, who won't be able to have children, in which case he can't fulfill this mitzvah, and we have to wait till he becomes of age, and we can tell whether he's a saris or not. So Rabbi Meir has this unique opinion that we have to worry about the minority. So even if you say, maybe we have to worry about the minority of people who don't know this halacha or don't keep this halacha, still, stam sifrei d'dayanei migmar gemiri. This isn't a usual case of minority, because who deals with the gets? The sofrim, the scribes. And the scribes all know the halacha. Scribes are knowledgeable people. They all know the halacha, even if they live abroad. Okay, well then why do we need this at all then? If we basically establish there's no concern, well, Rabbanan hu de'itzru. The rabbis said we have to do this. Why did the rabbis say we have to do this? Interesting. Machloka Rashi and Tosfot. Rashi says we have to do this because we're worried that maybe he took it out of the garbage. In other words, it's not just the sofrim, but maybe we're worried he pulled it out of the garbage, like I gave the case before. Tosfot says it's really that we're worried that the husband will show up and say, oh yeah, I got this from a sofer who was just practicing and happened to have filled out this with my name. And because of that, the rabbi said we better do this to protect the women again from this. Now, so let's just start where we were up to. Don't you need two? Well, you don't really need anything. But the rabbi said you should need it. But mishum iguna akilu barabanan. Punchline of today's daf, the most important line here is, well, the rabbi said if we're going to require that you have some sort of testimony, this is written lishma, just to preclude any possibilities in the future of the husband taking advantage, if we make him send two witnesses, okay, imagine the situation. The husband now has to send two witnesses to say, fanei neftam. He might just give up and say, you know what, I'm not going to even bother sending her a get. And then this woman's going to be an aguna. So they said, well, we're going to make you do this, but since you anyway have to send a messenger, so let that messenger do the work, and one witness is sufficient. Okay, but it's not really needed so much. That's basically what they're saying. But let's require it to protect the woman from, him claiming it's a forgery. But we're not going to require two, because then the husband will never do it and she'll be stuck as an aguna. So the end of our daf is basically, again, going back to how we started, that we want to protect the woman from being in a situation. She's abroad, he's there, she can't get remarried because he won't give her the get, because it's too much money to pay to send two people to bring this get, and that's why they said one is enough. So quick review of our daf. We started with the halacha, maybe get me Medina Hayam. We went through all different cases where you yes have to say it, don't have to say it, which places, border towns, all that. We'll get into all that much later. Then we gave these two basic reasons, Raba and Rava. What's the reason? Is it lishma, or is it because we won't be able to find witnesses later to verify their signatures? Then we gave three cases where there'd be a difference in the halacha, whether you say one or the other. And then we started with this question on Rabba, why do you only need one witness? Shouldn't you need two? We tried to say Eid Echad Ne'eman in general in these cases. Then we said not in this case. And then we explained why yes in this case, because really it's not so necessary. It's just a rabbinic thing they instituted, but then they instituted it to be easier so that the husband won't just give up and not give her a get, and she'll be living as an aguna. And we're going to see the same sugya. Okay, we're going to have a little more to do with this, and then some more questions on it tomorrow. And then we're going to see the same question on Rava. Why, according to him, is it enough to just have one? Welcome to Gittin, and we'll see you tomorrow.